you. My name is Mluleki Marongo. I work for the Right to Know campaign. I work on issues of access to information and participatory democracy. So welcome to this session. My job is pretty easy compared to what these two are here to do. We have Karabo from Amapungane. She'll say more about what she does. And then we've got Dale McKinley. Dr. Dale McKinley. Also an active member in the Right to Know campaign, founding member actually of the Right to Know campaign, and he also say more about what he's here to do. So I'm just going to give just a brief intro to the session, what we're here to speak about, and then I'll sit down and allow Karabo and Dale to give us the in-depth analysis. So the Republic of South Africa is founded in Section 1C of the Constitution on the supremacy of the Constitution and the rule of law. In terms of Section 1D, the Republic of South Africa is founded on the values of transparency, responsiveness, and accountability. One of the ways in which capture has manifested itself in South Africa is through the capture of intelligence agencies. Institutions with very important functions of states, of ensuring state security. We're speaking here of State Security Agency. We're speaking here on And so what we've seen, not just as a Right to Know campaign, but also as activists, as journalists, and I'm sure some political parties, including unions such as NUMSA, we've seen the use of these institutions, or should I say the abuse of these institutions in order to fulfill partisan interests. We've seen the use of these institutions to ensure or to spy on those who are critical of the state. We've seen the abuse of these institutions in intra-party politics, where within one party there are factions and they use these institutions to fight their own battles. We've seen these institutions being used to spy on civil society organizations. We've seen these institutions, and Karabo will speak more about this, through the spying of journalists. What does this all mean? Is there a way of envisioning these institutions after capture? After we've dealt with their capture, how can we re-envision their mandate? How can we envision a state security agency that does precisely what it's supposed to do? Not what one man says, not what one woman says, not what one party says. If you look at Chapter 10 of the Constitution, you find that public administration is supposed to be ethically driven, with high regard of professionalism. If you look at Chapter 11 of our Constitution, it says national security must be pursued in compliance with the law, including international law. National security is subject to the authority of Parliament. 199 says the security services must act and must teach and require their members to act in accordance with the Constitution and the law. No member of any security service may obey a manifestly illegal order. They may not prejudice a political party interest that is legitimate in terms of the Constitution. They may not further in any partisan manner any interest of a political party. How do we ensure that these institutions actually comply with these provisions? I think one of the most important questions is how do we as citizens not just mobilize and organize around these state institutions, but how do we hold them accountable as citizens? What's our role in reforming them? Karabo, are you going to be the first speaker?
Dale.
Dr. Dale McKinley will be our first one. Dale?
Okay. Thanks, Lou, and thank you, everyone, to opportunity to give this input. I'm going to cover I'm going to do a little bit of a historical overview because I fundamentally believe that in order to understand what has happened in the post-1994 period with security structures, intelligence structures in the state, and to understand the whole process of, quote, state capture, which I'll say right from the beginning is not limited to Zuma and to the Guptas. Certainly not with security intelligence. This has to be understood in a much longer-term historical perspective. And then looking at some of the key, possibly challenges and problems, I think Karabo will probably deal much more with much more specific case studies and applications of that, and maybe some of the things that we need to be thinking about with regards to reform. Just to remind ourselves that in terms of the apartheid history and the state, the entire foundational basis of the apartheid state, right from the beginning with the passage of, in the late 1940s and early 50s, the passage of all this legislation to take complete political and administrative control of the state by the National Party, was an ideologically saturated securitization of the state, or securocratization. So that word is very, securitization is actually to deal with finances. Securocratization is the word that we use to say the securocrats, those that were in power in military intelligence, crime intelligence, state intelligence, the police, so forth and so on, the army, and those services began to take fundamental central control and power of most avenues of the state. And the legislation that was passed in the 1950s in particular, for example, the Suppression of Communism Act, the Criminal Laws Amendment Act of 1953, the Public Safety Act of 1953, the Riotous Assemblies Act of 1956, all of these pieces of legislation, some, by the way, which are still with us. It's amazing to see, and we'll talk about which apartheid pieces of legislation still remain with us. But these sort of gave the framing of, essentially this fairly widespread securitization of the state. And there were many, many other, the Terrorism Act of 1967 later, and of course, the Internal Security Act of 1982 and so forth. Institutionalized power given to the securocrats. Now what's the importance of this in terms of the post-apartheid period? Well, the argument here is basically that as a result of this closing down of space, and we know the history, the ANC and the liberation movements were forced into exile, banned, took up the armed struggle from exile and everything else, is that the impact both at an individual and organizational level was quite substantial, and I will argue has carried over into the way in which governance was approached in the post-1994 period. So for example, when the ANC went into exile, they were forced into a very secretive, very closed spaces where everybody was, afraid of everybody else being a spy. Or, and we know a lot of the stories that in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, with even someone like Chris Hani being arrested by ANC state security structures, intelligence structures, for potentially being too critical of the leadership. And what we also saw was this militarization, the dominance of a sort of sabotage MK campaign. This led to, in many ways, as Raymond Suttner and many others have pointed out, a culture of machoism, of militarization, of secrecy, of a distrust, generally speaking, for those outside of the inner circle. And you saw this when the ANC then came back from exile in the post-1990, the battle between the internals and the externals with regards to how the ANC itself was going to, and how the liberation movement was going to be its content and character. And the exile certainly, I think, largely won that battle in the context of the negotiated settlement and so forth. So highly secretive organizational, minimal involvement of people, a generally closing down of information, a general distrust and so forth. Centralization of power centered on a small collection of leadership. Crucially, in terms of democratic content, this, and I argue this, is that this overarching ideology and rhetoric did not distinguish between the party, quote, the state, and the people itself. So if one wants to understand the political rhetoric of the ANC in the post-1994 period and how it has dealt with dissent and how it has dealt with those that it doesn't agree with, I believe you have to locate this within this historical frame, where essentially the way in which the culture that was became dominant was, as I'm quoting Raymond Suttner here, a warrior culture, the militarist tradition, which entailed not only heroic acts, but many cases of abuse of power, leading to the emergence of a movement as a prototype of a state within a state, in which it sees itself as the only legitimate source of power. So this was before the ANC even came into power. This is before even Mandela became the first president, where this I would argue that this was a very strong, it certainly wasn't the only strand, there were certainly competing strands within the movement, but certainly this was a dominant one, I would argue. So this was accompanied by an ever-increasing influence of, once the ANC accessed power, of a fairly decidedly bureaucratic, centralized, and hierarchical organizational forms that were then replaced the more popular civil society grounded organizations that had marked the resistance, at least internally, to the apartheid state. So essentially what this provided for was, once the ANC took power in 1994, it provided for a continuity. There was no better example than this continuity in terms of the way power was exercised than in intelligence and security structures. Right? So while you had, for example, in some of the other structures, fairly rapid transformation in regards to personnel, even though the 5-year deal with the National Party in terms of the government and national unity obviously put massive constraints on the transformation of the state itself. But it was very clear, if one was paying attention, that the security and intelligence structures were the least changed of all in the first many years. In other words, there was still, and this is not surprising, because if you take, we're talking about, intelligence officers, and if you're an intelligence person, if you're a spook, right? The fundamental principle of a spook is you serve your boss. It's not an ideological issue, generally speaking. A professional spook and a professional spy is not, can serve a left-wing president, an administration, and a right-wing at the same time. And this is historically in many countries has been the case. There's been a continuity. And this is what happened in South Africa with regards to a lot of the apartheid spies, a lot of that Bureau of State Security remained fairly intact, and certainly a lot of those individuals into the new era. And they basically taught and passed on a lot of those things, because Imbokodo, which was the ANC's security intelligence wing, had more in common with the apartheid spooks than they did outside of, once the racial thing was gone. In terms of professionally, it was, okay, who are the enemies of the state? Who are the new enemies of the state? Who are the ones we need to watch? And you can forget about the past fairly quickly in that regard. And this certainly happened to a large extent with regards to the first few years of the post-apartheid government, ANC-run government. And in turn, I would argue that this kind of culture that sort of permeated the notion that, us versus them, we have to watch who the enemies out there. It's now a situation of the ANC versus, the other forces, or the government versus the enemy, is political obedience to both the new state, in the form of the ANC, and the party that would control it. So in other words, if there's any sort of oath that a security and intelligence person needs to take, it's to the party that they belong to, if they do, or the state itself, which they serve. And as Salim Bali has argued, what this did was, the immediate result of this political triumph over apartheid was the continuity, and I'm quoting, of the dominant interest that determined the strategic thrust of the South African state. I'll read that again. A continuity of the dominant interest that determined the strategic thrust of the United States, including not just ownership of the commanding heights of the economy, which is a whole other debate in terms of lack of transformation, but the repressive apparatus of the state. It fundamentally did not change, is the base. There was a much more of a continuity than there was in terms of a change. So, in turn, what did that then produce? Once this, well, the very first example of this was the adoption of one of the key macroeconomic programs, which was the Growth, Employment, and Redistribution Program. If people remember this was a surprise that was sort of, it was supposed to be the RDP, and this redistributed, and all of a sudden here, which was very much of for a lot of people within the ANC and in the movement, very much of a sort of neoliberal kind of like, where it's coming from, this is not what we agreed to, created a lot of consternation. But despite all of those debates, what I want to point out is, how did the state respond to criticism? This was the very first way in which we can assess how the ANC state responded to fundamental criticism about a direction it was taking for the country, in this case, a macroeconomic frame. Do you remember what Trevor Manuel said about GEAR? People remember when he got onto national television. He said it's non-negotiable. Those were his words. It's non-negotiable. What that means is there is no debate. There is no talk. It is shut down. Anyone who does that then, anyone who questions and engages that, is varyingly a troublemaker, a dissenter, unpatriotic, whatever you want to call, counter-revolutionary, and it went on and on. So, that example, in terms of the response to GEAR, I would argue, sort of set the scene in terms of the role of the security and state intelligence services with regards to dissent, even though it was on an economic front. How can we look at that in the context of legislation then? Going back to that, seeing how the South African state then approached both past and new legislation that would govern, within the Constitution, that would govern a lot of the activities of the security and intelligence services. Well, if people remember, in 1996, there was the passage of what was called the Safety Matters Rationalization Act. Safety Matters Rationalization Act. This act repealed a total of 34 apartheid-era laws dealing with security legislation and several pieces of legislation for the but several pieces were maintained and remain as law today. What are some of those? So while a lot of these were gotten rid of, they chose, and it's very instructive, what to maintain, what they didn't get rid of. One was the Riotous Assemblies Act, 1956. It's still on the books, which among other things makes it crime punishable about up to 20 years for, quote, disrupting the operations of secretly designated national key points, such as ESCOM, airports, military bases, government buildings, so forth and so on. The Protection of Information Act of 1982 still remains on our books, right? They tried to replace it with the Protection of State Information Act, which was a secrecy bill, but it's still on the President's desk after 6 years, which we can talk about later. But nonetheless, that remains. The Regulations of Gatherings Act, which is 1993, so late apartheid, but still before 1994, governs gatherings, protests, and so forth. Defines the shape and size and location of rights according to gatherings. Besides this, though, in 1996, there was a very important thing that happened, which wasn't a piece of legislation, but was an internal process, which was a unilateral implementation of what was called the Minimum Information Security Standards, MISS, 1986. This was an internal government cabinet thing, which basically, in the name of ensuring, and I'm quoting, that the national interests of the Republic are protected, it set down information security standards for all government departments and institutions based upon 4 categories of classification: restricted, confidential, secret, top secret. Besides that, the MIS also placed a thick veil of secrecy on all apartheid-era state information. So we also, the reason why Henny and state secrets and Michael, you see you're here, to access these things, MIS is at the heart of that, of basic, and this was an internal, non-democratic, not decided, not debated within Parliament, not passed, but governing basically the handling of information both from the past and the present. And of course, the effectiveness and impact of that, despite the Promotion of Access to Information Act, which was later passed in 2000, seriously compromised, I would argue, the democratic accountability, certainly of the state, but also the security forces in terms of accessing information, management, and so forth. Okay? Then, of course, as you know, there was the anti-terrorism bill, which was called, I love this one, it's the best named bill ever, Protection of Constitutional Democracy Against Terrorist and Related Activities. Protection of constitutional democracy against, so it's not, and it sounds very, very positive that we're protecting our country against terrorists, but it's an anti-terrorism bill which was passed in 2004, which has a whole range of potentially problematic areas in that. You give huge amounts of power to some of the security intelligence services. So these are just, I'm just giving a broad brush perspective. But by the end of the first decade, post-1994 decade, I think that essentially what was happening, and if you take the arms deal that was already beginning to come to the surface with regards to some of the corruption and some of the capture, essentially the capture that had taken place was not a capture by corporate capital, was not a capture by outside interests who were corrupting the state for their own private purposes or accumulation of profit or tenderpreneurs and everything. But the capture of the state, in many cases by that state, was by a politics and by an approach, both within the ANC and within some of the old guard, of the continuities of a fairly secret, securitized, repressive or anti-dissent kind of security and intelligence terrain in many cases. And it was much too close to that displayed by the apartheid regime. In other words, even if differentially located and experienced, what this revealed was the inherited states of fear and loathing, reflecting both individual and organizational insecurities about power and place, about acceptance and legitimacy. In other words, the perfect incubator for secrecy, for lack of accountability, for intelligence services to begin to do things that had nothing to do with protecting democracy and certainly the people. And what did we begin to see in the early 2000s? Precisely that. So once the scene was set, what role mainly did the intelligence and security services play? Outside of doing their basic jobs of gathering information on potential foreign powers and spying activities, which they don't ever have seemed to be particularly good at. I mean, the information that we've received from all the research is that foreign spooks consider South Africa to be one of the most porous and most easily compromised security intelligence services in the world, where they can just basically get all the information they want when they want it and to operate here almost with impunity in that context. So that's another story. But in the context of what the information of the security intelligence services then began to do, well, let's just take a quick look at that. They began to basically be used, not surprisingly, to fight political battles and ideological battles, both within the ANC, which began to surface very clearly from the early 2000s on, but also with regards to protecting elite interests and those who wanted to then capture the state in different kinds of ways, or particular departments and corruption internally. So what we saw, and I'm going through this very quickly, and those of you who know this history also, is that as a result of this, a ministerial commission was appointed, the Matthews Commission, which was appointed by then Minister of Intelligence Ronnie Kasrils in 2006. And the Matthews Commission came out with a fairly damning report. And I'm just going to summarize its key findings, which were that the services had been completely politicized, no surprise there, the intelligence and security services, and thus, and I'm quoting from the report, drawn into the realm of party politics, requiring them to monitor and investigate legal political activity, and as a result have undermined political rights that are entrenched in the Constitution. That was from the Commission itself. And it then goes on to explain that accountability to the public was weak, excessive secrecy, focusing on inappropriate, lawful political activities. The mandate was overbroad, and the overbroad conception of what constitutes national security, and so forth and so on. Essentially, the Matthews Commission was stated that the security intelligence services were no longer answerable to the demos, were no longer answerable to Parliament, no longer answerable to the people, but were answerable to a certain section of the state and that is capture. It's a different kind of capture. In terms of, it's not a capture from the outside, certainly, or for people, it's a capture of a particular, very important section of the state for, in this case, factional, political, other purposes, and abusing that power to protect their interests, or to go after others that were, including dissenters and activists and so forth and so on. And we'll talk about that. Of course, there's also the other side, which I know Karaba will talk about, which is not just the sort of physical monitoring. We've got all sorts of examples of where people have been, monitored, but eavesdropping, electronic communications, and despite the regulation of interception of communications and RICA, in Provision of Communication-Related Information Act of 2002, there's a whole range of problems with that, and Right to Know and others have, over the years, surfaced a lot of the loopholes and problems there, and so have many investigative journalists with regards to the secret services not applying the law and certainly going around it in order to tap into phones, in order to surveil people, and so forth. Okay, just tell me how much time, how much time I have left.
7 more minutes. Then
7 more. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. 7 more.
I want to give questions and
no, sure.
more.
I just need to know more or less what we're looking at here. Okay, so let's go then into a couple of sort of more contemporary, in the contemporary period, moving from the Zuma era. Of course, during the Zuma period, what I've just described basically came to the fore very, very much in terms of all the activities of the security intelligence services, everything from the way in which the police and security services responded to the Marikana strike and to the strike of the miners, and how they basically served the interests of a particular set of elites in that context by murdering so many miners, to the activities of covering up the other parts of the state capture of the Zukta crew in terms of the mining sector, and so forth and so on. I've got the nuclear side of things, the Durban port, energy pricing, e-tolls. We can go through a whole range of contemporary examples during that period from 2007 all the way to about 2000, and also obviously energy issues as well, and the minerals energy complex, and the construction of the new Medupi and Kusile and all of the overruns and so forth. Okay, so in the context of looking at this at a macro level, I just want to, the way I look at this is a three-sided matrix that understands the way in which this capture has taken place. One, the first side of that matrix is the conscious, politically and materially driven closing down of South Africa's constitutionally enshrined right of access to information. Basically, you ask any civil society organization, you ask any academic, you ask anybody who's tried to access information outside of basic stuff, it's a wall. It is impossible. It is virtually, it's either refusal or very, small smidgens here and there. But essentially, what we have is we have the security intelligence services play a very important role in that. And that is, in protecting that information. Because as the ANC people themselves have said, the small Anyana skeletons that exist in everybody's closet, and don't want to get out because they would all be compromised. That would be one. The second side of this matrix is the militarization and centralization of power within the coercive forces of the state. So one can look at the police and how the police have been generally, going back and forth in terms of the militarization there and how they've responded to protest, or in the case of the intelligence services, the way in which they have responded, obviously, to what they perceived enemies. And also, by the way, the other side of that militarization, securitization, is the private security industry, which has been allowed basically to do it at once. So we have a private security industry in which there are more members than there are in the National Army. 1.4 million by last count, as far as I know, private security guards in this country. That is a private army. That is a private army that has no regulation hardly, even though there is, by the way, a bill that has been sitting in Parliament, I think, for now 3 or 4 years, private security matters bill, which is supposed to regulate this, but which hasn't, as far as I understand, still been passed. So that's a whole other side of the story, that we protecting private interests and other things that oftentimes works hand in glove, depending upon the situation. And the third side of this matrix is the law. And the abuse of the law, still some of the laws that are on the books that maintain the sort of closure of space, they continue to give powers. I haven't even mentioned the legislation that's been passed over the last 10 years that has given more powers. So the General Intelligence Laws Amendment Bill, which gave basically, and this passed without hardly a murmur, besides from Right to Know and others, which was an amazingly important piece of legislation, because what it did is it merged domestic and foreign security and intelligence services. It merged them. The ANC's position from 1994 was that it had to be separated. You cannot have domestic and foreign in the same. You cannot, because then the lines of accountability get blurred. Now we've got them all in the same. It's the State Security Agency has brought everything under one house. It's given huge powers to the minister. It's given huge powers to the State Security Agency to determine a range of different kinds of measures of what it does disclose, what's classified, what's not, and so forth and so on. National key points is a whole other issue, and we can see that in the last 5 years, there's been a 50% increase in the number of national key points, by the way. So you name national key points and then special legislation applies. You can't do this to them, you can't protest, you can't if you're found taking pictures, whatever not, all that other kind of stuff applies. And this still remains the case. Just to sort of, there's the cyber crimes bill, which is still right now in front of Parliament, which we won't even have time to go into, but just suffice to say that there's some very problematic elements in there with regards to criminalizing online expression and dissent and a whole range of new possibilities for the role of intrusiveness and oversight of people's, what they write and what they put onto the internet and how they communicate electronically. And this political driven intelligence of crime intelligence and everything, where now you have the use of things like the grabber machine. Everybody knows what the grabber machine is, which is a piece of technology that we've proven that I think there's 3 or 4 of them in South Africa now, 2 in private sector, maybe 2 owned by the state, which essentially is a suitcase-sized thing which you put up and it dominates, it basically puts out a cell phone signal that overpowers all the masts in the particular area. So anytime you pick up your cell phone and you text or you call, it goes to there. So they can intercept any particular metadata on your phone, or if you've got the very sophisticated software, you can voice data as well as text data within a 5-kilometer radius. So, and I can personally testify to having been the victim of a grabber at the anti-xenophobia march about 3 or 4 years ago when we were all at Mary Fitzgerald Square. And all of a sudden we were in the Mary Fitzgerald, and all of our cell phones started going nuts. Everybody's cell phone was going on and off, and all sorts of things were going crazy. You couldn't call, you couldn't do anything out with it, and people were going, what's going on? I turned my cell phone off. When I turned it back on, every single piece of data in the phone was sucked out. All my contacts were gone, everything was gone. I could not even access it in my phone anymore. It was taken. It was simply just erased from there. And many others were similar kinds of experiences on that day. We saw drones flying overhead, so forth. So these are all sorts of things that just are not necessarily purely anecdotal, but give an indication that there are these kinds of activities that could be taking place. Finally, just to wrap up, is to say that oftentimes this area, this securitization of the state, has been overshadowed by all the bigger state capture stories in the last few years in terms of the Guptas and the corrupt relationships and everything. And in some ways, it's a measure of the success of the security intelligence services if they are not paid attention to. The quieter things are on that front, the more successful they are. They don't want, the attention shouldn't be there for them. You don't want to draw attention to yourself. You want to operate in the shadows, you want to operate behind. And we haven't even talked about the interception capabilities and all sorts of other things that are going on behind the scenes with regards to RICA. But the bottom line is that we have a situation, irregardless of a new president. So in the context of Ramaphosa, he has made a review panel. And you might talk about this, I don't know, Karabo, but there's a review panel of which our own Jane Duncan, who's right to know and everything, sits on there. Problem is that nobody knows what they're doing. Nobody knows what the terms of reference are. Nobody has any access to information of what they've so it's very secretive. The whole idea is very secretive. We're going to get on to Jane very quickly, and we're going to extract information from her, I'm sure, sooner or later. But it's still that mentality that if you do things that have to do with security intelligence, they have to be in the you don't shine the light. It has to be in the dark. And it only can be shared within a very select number of people, and then they will act on those things. That's an inherently anti-democratic, anti-constitutional approach, as we know. So there's this constant tension that goes on here. The Inspector General of Intelligence, which is another area which is a potentially positive development, Dintwe, who we invited to be on this panel, but who didn't respond at all in the context. He has got a massive backload of complaints and cases sitting on his desk. He claims he's very under-resourced, which is probably true, but there is, the levels of the possibility of holding some of these people accountable is not going very far, very quickly at all. The information regulator, the same thing, completely underfunded. We went and met with the information regulator a few months ago, Panzi Klakula, former IEC chair. Panzi was saying, our hands are tied, we can't do anything, we have no budget. We are not being given any means to pursue these kinds of things. So we can see that essentially everywhere we're going in the context of securitization, there are barriers in the way to open this up, and we don't really know what's going on. We can talk about how, for example, I haven't even mentioned, the one area which shows you that the security intelligence services are not doing their job, which is what their job is, if you would think, to go after organized crime. If there is any threat to the stability of this country, it's organized crime, in the context of both the police and outside and drug, whatever you want, cartels, criminal syndicates, everything else. Their complete failure over the last several years to basically, I mean, that's the hollowing out of the state to a certain extent at the other political levels, but the security intelligence service have been essentially hobbled, or in many cases are not, or themselves are compromised or involved in these kinds of things, we don't know. But instead, most of their efforts and energies have gone to the political, ideological side of things, and basically serving the political killings, for example, that have gone on over the last 3 years in KwaZulu-Natal. 120 people in Cleveland's hostel have been killed. Not a single, two people have been arrested, one has been convicted. That's a failure of intelligence, a massive failure. Xenophobic violence, a failure of intelligence. You should be able to, all these other kinds of things, it's a total failure. So in the context of the core mandates of the intelligence security services, they get a F completely. But when it comes to political interference and serving political masters, they get an A. And that's the problem we have in our country.
Thank you, Jay. Karabo?
Sure. Right. Well, after the doctor has done a good job of identifying the pathologies of our intelligence agencies, I'm going to give a much narrower presentation around the effect of the corruption of our intelligence agencies on journalists, not because journalists have been the only group of individuals, people to be affected by the capture of the state and what is done for media institutions, but because it speaks about the problem of the desire of the state when there is state capture to control information flows. And I think this is something that's not unique to our current problems around, well, most recent problems around state capture, but as a feature of our state going before 1994. Dr. Dale took us far beyond, far further than 94. I'm going to start my presentation at 2015, simply because 3 things happened in 2015, which I think I begin to identify what the problems are and where the potentials for reform are for our intelligence services. The first thing which happened in 2015, many of you may remember this, is on the 12th of February 2015, we had our State of the Nation address. Our State of the Nation addresses under Zuma's administrations became increasingly sites of security. So when you went to Parliament during State of the Nation, there were barricades, the army was there. But what happened on the evening of the State of the Nation, and many of you will recall this, is that there was the disruption of the signal. And journalists in the parliamentary gallery that night started tweeting to say we no longer have access to our cell phones, we can't communicate, we can't say what is happening. And the broadcast feed at Parliament was turned away from the EFF's so-called disruption to focus only on the speaker. This became one of the first challenges of the involvement of state security in a parliamentary space, and that was subject to a legal challenge by Right to Know, the Open Democracy Centre, as well as the South African Editors Forum, based on the principle of the state security agencies should not have that kind of role within a democracy, but particularly around an institution like Parliament. The second thing which happened in 2015 was we had been hearing murmurs, rumors about the intelligence agencies essentially spying on the communications of SABC journalists. Now, the SABC is one of the national key points, but there had been, just murmurings that this was happening. In 2015, it was August, I recall, SABC journalists in the Durban office said, we've been asked to leave our offices, state security hasn't arrived, and they're essentially doing a sweep of our offices, and we don't know why they're doing it, they're not giving us an explanation. But we understand that was potentially around the state security agency wanting to identify the so-called leaks of information, so wanting to know what the journalistic sources were of these SABC journalists. This obviously happened this happened in the context of the capture of the SABC. In 2014, the Public Protector had issued a report on Claudio Motsoneng as the CEO, essentially issuing a damning report about his role in interfering with the editorial independence of the SABC. This report was simply ignored. The other thing which happened in 2015 was the then Minister of Communications then tried to centralize power to herself through the Broadcasting Amendment Bill. Thankfully, that has also been legally challenged. But this highlights how state capture and surveillance of journalists was happening at the SABC, was happening at Parliament. A third thing which happened in 2015 relates to Amabungane, where I'm from. And what happened in 2015 is that we found out for the first time through actual evidence that one of our journalists, Sam Sol, had been the subject of an interception warrant. Now, one of the problems of our current intelligence functions and RICA, which I'll go into a bit more detail, is that there's absolute secrecy around when surveillance happens, how it happens, and why it happens. So as Sam Sol, we had suspected for some time that surveillance had happened when he was doing, or when the team was doing, in-depth investigations into Zuma's corruption scandals, in particular in 2008, 2009, around some still arms deal corruption scandals, as well as doing investigations around the decision to drop charges against former President Zuma. We had asked at the time, and this was in 2009, the then Inspector General of Intelligence to look at whether or not Sam Sols and other journalists at Amabungane and the Mail and Guardian had had their communications intercepted. The Inspector General at the time issued a report, and this was short in 2014, to say there was no conclusive evidence of any kinds of interception having taken place. But in 2015, when the DA, the Democratic Alliance, launched their challenge to have the spy tapes matter reviewed, in the responding papers which were issued by Zuma's lawyer at the time, Michael Hulley, attached as an annexure to that was a transcript of Sam Sol's communications with one of his sources, Billy Downer, a prosecutor at the NPA. And this gave us for the first time actual evidence that there had been some kind of communication surveillance, which we were then able to use to then launch our RICA challenge. What we did in 2015, and this is before the RICA challenge I'll go into a bit later, is we then wanted to go back to the new Inspector General, so this is a different Inspector General, to ask, based on this concrete evidence of surveillance having taken place, so Sam Sol's communications having been tapped, can you confirm that this took place? Can you give explanations for the legality of this having taken place? And can you provide us with the interception warrant? And so the way that RICA works is that a member of the intelligence agencies must get a warrant from the designated RICA judge. We eventually, in 2017, got access to the interception warrant. Although what we got access to, and we used the Promotion of Access to Information Act, and very surprisingly we were able to get something out of the intelligence agencies using it. What we were able to get from this process was a copy of the interception directive, or the warrant, which allowed for the so-called lawful interception of Sam Sol's communications. This warrant is not sufficient, so what we got was a copy of the request for extension of communication surveillance. So not the original warrant, which was requested from the RICA judge, but simply asking for more time to listen in on Sam Sol's communications. And what we know is that this happened over a course of 6 months. And what is concerning about this, and should be concerning for academics and other members of the public, is that it wasn't merely his communications with Billy Downer, but it was every single one of his communications with family members, friends, other individuals who shouldn't have had their privacy violated in such a way. The other thing which was useful about getting a report from the Inspector General, and this is the current Inspector General, Dr. Dintwe, was that he for the first time provided some kind of report about what had taken place. Now there's two things which came out of this. One was that it happened for 6 months, but two was that there was no consideration given for the fact that Sam Sol, as a subject of the interception warrant, was a journalist and therefore had a duty and obligation under law to protect his sources. So these three examples of the signal jamming at Parliament in 2015, the capture of the SABC and SABC journalists, as well as the interception warrant and surveillance of Sam Sol and potentially other journalists, speaks to us, in my assessment, three areas which would need to be on the reform agenda for the intelligence agencies, because they speak to where and why the abuse of power happens in the way that it does. The first, I would argue, is that the reform agenda needs to look very, very intentionally, and I'll go into detail, needs to look very intentionally at how our oversight institutions work or currently do not work effectively in order to push for much greater independence. Secondly, it's that our intelligence agencies have been given an almost right to operate under excessive secrecy. And thirdly, is that we need to have much stronger safeguards against the potential abuses of power, as well as accountability mechanisms. So when it comes to independence, one of the things that has really struck me when we went, Wrighton and a few other colleagues from civil society, went to have a meeting with the Inspector General of Intelligence last year, was that the Office of the Inspector General of Intelligence is in the same location as the state security agency, literally a few doors down. And I think this speaks in a very real way to the problem of what's happening with our current oversight responsibilities with the Inspector General of Intelligence, is that that relationship itself is too close. And not just too close in terms of proximity, a few doors down, but it's also too close in terms of the reporting lines. And so Dale spoke about the work of the Matthews Commission report, which was a 2007 report. And it's useful in terms of what it provided us as a public in terms of understanding where the problems lie. Some of the problems that the Matthews Commission report identified in this regard were that it's a matter of unclear lines of accountability for the Inspector General of Intelligence Office. So, for example, the budget of the Inspector General of Intelligence, although is granted through a parliamentary budget vote, is still in part managed by the state security agencies. In terms of being able to get a proper mandate out of this proper mandate, the administration of the Inspector General of Intelligence still lies in part with the state security agencies. So in other words, the oversight institution is still bound in many ways by the institution that it's trying to oversee. You can't have an oversight institution both being accountable to and then holding account the very same institution, which is problematic. But I would say that the problem with the Matthews Commission report being used as a constant reference point around reform and independence or looking at oversight independence is that it is a very dated report. It's 2007. What we know is that there have been significant technological developments which now need to be considered and hopefully will be considered in this current review of the intelligence agencies. So in other words, we need to have the same kind of comprehensive review of intelligence agencies to understand what the current threats are in light of the new technological capacities of our intelligence agencies. I think another case which speaks to the problem of independence of our Inspector General of Intelligence are the two legal matters that are before our courts. Now, the first was a case which was launched by the IGI this year, and this was in relation to the then, I feel as if it's constantly saying the then, but the former State Security Agency head, Arthur Fraser, the DG, Arthur Fraser, refusing to grant Dintwe the correct vetting grade in order for him to pursue investigation against Arthur Fraser. And this was an investigation that the IGI was undertaking around Arthur Fraser's complicity in what was in a parallel network in the early 2000s. Now, Dintwe's legal challenges, particularly important because he makes many of the same arguments that the Matthews Commission made around the need for greater institutional independence. There's a second legal challenge, and this is one that has been launched by the Democratic Alliance. And this relates to the President's and the Minister of State Security's decision to move Arthur Fraser across to become the new person in charge of correctional services. Now, the DA's application is interesting for this case in two respects. One is the response that our current President has had around this particular approach of both the Inspector General and the DA. Now, Ramaphosa has concernedly said that trying to remedy the problems around institutional oversight shouldn't be done through a court process. Now, court processes give us probably the most amount of insight into what's happening, but should rather be done internally through the intelligence agency's own internal review. And this speaks to wanting to reform, but in the shadows, which is very problematic. And as Dale has mentioned already, the review process which is underway of the intelligence agencies, while it does have one or two good human rights activists and academics, it's being done in complete secret. We don't have access to the terms of reference, so we don't know what they're looking at in terms of how to reform the intelligence agencies. The second matter which often comes up when conversations about intelligence review or reform come up is, but are you asking us to make a choice between security or transparency? And this is obviously a very false, a false option-giving process. And I've heard it from people within the intelligence agencies that any push towards greater transparency will hurt the effectiveness of our intelligence agencies. Now, why do I say that it's false? And I think many others have said that this is a false choice. Well, the first is that we know that, and I think Dale made an excellent case around it, that essentially the intelligence agencies aren't doing their job. And so greater transparency will be about allowing the public to be able to ask the intelligence agencies with the correct information to do the proper job. But what we have seen through many cases and investigations is that in areas which are crucial, so for example, the budget which the state security gets, that process is done in almost complete secrecy. Not that we don't know how much the state security agency gets. We know through figures in parliamentary budget. So just to explain how state security gets its budget, which is unusual, it happens through a transfer from Treasury's budget to state security. So all we know about the amount of money that state security has is just by one figure. So in 2011, it was at about 3 million. It went up to 4.3 million. And I think in the last budget vote at the beginning of the year, it was at, sorry, no, this is billion, not million. They're definitely they're under-resourced. It was 5 billion. But the problem with knowing only this global figure, with only knowing about a global figure of what the state security agency gets, is that we simply don't know how the state security agency spends its money. Now, it's not about wanting to know every single detail and every single line item, but I think in this case, it's the Matthews Commission report correctly identified to say there's some matters which aren't subject to national security, which shouldn't be subject to such secrecy. Knowing how much the state security agency spends, for example, on office supplies or just basic information should be public information. We also know that through a number of corruption scandals which have plagued our agencies, it's often the secretive use of money which is tied to this. So what needs to be kept secret? I think the Matthews Commission report provides a good starting point to say on operational matters that does not need to be subject to the kinds of secrecy which it is currently subject to. And then obviously on strategic matters there needs to be a correct balancing act, and that relates to budget, both in terms of budget but also other matters which the State Security Agency is responsible for. What we're also seeing, and I think this is a concern, is that although we've been able to push back on something like the Protection of State Information Bill through the Right to Know campaign and other organizations and civil society, we are seeing a creep of the same kind of thinking in other legislation. Dale spoke about the cyber crimes bill. The same could be true for the current National Key Points Act, which is being changed into the Critical Infrastructure bill. So we're seeing the same kind of securitized thinking seeping into other forms of legislation. And for example, the lack of clarity on something like what defines national security, which is often used as a cover for all sorts of other corrupt activity and practice. The third area, which I think isn't spoken enough in terms of this desire for secrecy by our intelligence agencies, is the effect that this has had on our private sector. Now, the RICA law makes it compulsory for our telecommunications service providers, so our MTN, Cell C, Vodacom, to provide them with metadata related to their customers, and this is required by law. But the process in which this happens in absolute secrecy. So the telecom providers themselves are barred from disclosing this information. And furthermore, South Africa is one of the few countries where these service providers simply don't provide any kind of transparency reporting. So and what we're looking for in terms of transparency reporting is not necessarily the detail of whose numbers were given over to the state security agencies, but rather the statistics around it. So 10,000 customers' numbers were handed over to state security agencies for some kind of interception of communications. And this is common practice in many other countries, and yet South Africa is one of 6 countries where this simply doesn't happen. And if we understand state capture to not just only be about the state acting in ways which are antithetical to a democracy, it's also about those who are complicit in enabling these kinds of behaviors, then the failure of these private companies, these telecommunications companies, to provide at minimum transparency to their customers is also concerning, because that makes them complicit in the success of secrecy, which allows corruption to thrive. So the third point, and I think this is where the reform agenda becomes, this is where the reform agenda is best articulated, is how do you create adequate safeguards against these excessive abuses of power and the excesses of secrecy? One way, and this is the subject of Amabungani's challenge against our interception law, as well as right to know is applied to be amicus in the case, is to challenge the very law which allows this to happen. And so RICA is the law which is our surveillance law, and was signed in 2002. And what Amabungani is saying is that RICA was a law which allowed Samsol's communications to be intercepted lawfully. And so the challenge is on 2 grounds. The first is that lawful interception, in the way that it's construed in RICA right now, is unconstitutional. And the reason it's unconstitutional is for a number of reasons, but I'll highlight 3 of them. The first centers around saying that the process around getting an interception warrant, so the directive itself, is very, very vulnerable to capture. And we see examples of this not just from the Samsol case, but as identified in Right to Know's Vogt report, where the process is very vulnerable, where a RICA judge can be essentially lied to by a member of the intelligence agencies, crime intelligence. So what the RICA constitutional challenge says is that that judicial oversight process around granting a warrant needs to be strengthened. And the argument there is simply to say, in other jurisdictions and other countries, rather than having just a singular judge who's responsible for this huge amount of power to grant our intelligence agencies the right to listen in on communications, this needs to be done rather by a panel of judges, in order for there to be some kind of debate and deliberation around whether or not to grant an interception directive. And secondly, it's not sufficient just to have the panel of judges, but because that process of granting an interception warrant itself is done in secret, it's done behind closed doors, it's not done in open court, there needs to be somebody in the room to be a public advocate of the individual or individuals who may have their communications put under surveillance. And so one of the proposals which comes out of the RICA challenge is to say there should be a public advocate, and we see this working very effectively in other jurisdictions. A second point which speaks to the importance of transparency is to say, in the current RICA process, our current surveillance mechanisms, there's simply no notification to any individual whether or not they've been subject to any kind of surveillance. We see again in many other countries that some kind of retrospective notification, so after the fact, is done to ensure that if the person whose communications have been under surveillance has concern or legitimate concern to say, but why was I the subject of the state's interest, that can be reviewed through a court process. Now the sort of this argument of, but surely too much transparency around this will have a negative consequence for crime fighting and other mechanisms. The counter argument to that is quite simple, is that this is after the fact notification. So once the state has completed its alleged crime fighting or crime trying to do investigations and so forth, there should be notification, and this will not have an impact on the state's ability to go about its legitimate activities. The third area, and this speaks to technological developments, is around how the state keeps data of individuals which it has put under surveillance or has requested telecommunications providers to put under surveillance. Now we know that data retention has become a huge concern just because of the advance in technological developments. under RICA currently, the state is lawfully allowed to keep data of a person who's been under surveillance between 3 to 5 years. And so in the interception warrant that we got for Sam Saul, we saw that his metadata had been kept for a period of 5 years. But what's not clear from RICA is what then happens. What is the disposal process once the period of surveillance has concluded? And who has access to all of that data which is swept up by the state? And so one of the things which I think is crucial in terms of creating adequate safeguards is, and this is introduced as a proposal in the RICA challenge, is that the process around eliminating the data once it has been collected needs to be done in a much more systematic way to ensure that it can't be abused in other circumstances. Of concern, though, in the RICA challenge, and I think this is a concern which speaks to a future application by the right to know, is surveillance which happens completely outside of any lawful mechanism. And so similar to the United States NSA program, South Africa too has its own mass surveillance program. And this is located in the National Communications Centers. Now, what we have discovered through the process of our RICA challenge is that there doesn't seem to be any kind of lawful base for the kinds of mass surveillance, so the mass sweep up of citizens or citizens, non-citizens communications. So only their metadata, not the content of their communications. What the RICA challenge says very clearly is that any kind of surveillance which infringes on the rights of privacy of ordinary people needs to be done lawfully, because it is an invasion of privacy in a very profound way. And the only way that an invasion of privacy can be justified is where there's a legitimate crime fighting or corruption removal. So it needs to be done for a legitimate basis, but it needs to be done because there's a legitimate investigation underway rather than it simply being done as a matter of course. So I think this is going to be a particular area which will be interesting to see what the outcome will be from that RICA challenge on how we can get this mass surveillance capacity in line with our constitutional principles. Another aspect that the RICA challenge picks up is the importance of the threshold for when when surveillance can take place. Now, the Amabungani challenge is quite different with the right to know amicus application. But the Amabungani challenge says that there's certain categories of individuals within society who are required to have their communications secure. And so this is the case for journalists who've got a professional obligation to keep their sources secure. But it's also a professional obligation for lawyers, as two categories within society have got an obligation to have confidential communications. Right now, and we saw with the Inspector General of Intelligence report to us on Sam Saul, that is not considered at all in the process of granting an interception warrant. Now we see that in other jurisdictions, and one case that has come around this has been in the UK and the EU, where a recent case in the Big Brother Watch versus others in the UK found clearly that a person's profession, so if they're a journalist, needs to be taken into consideration where any kind of surveillance needs to be taken place. And I think this is important case law which may influence the South Africa RICA challenge. Right to Know has joined as amicus, and in many respects they agree with the arguments that the Amabungani case puts forth. But they take it a step further, and importantly so, because the Right to Know challenge says something a little bit different to our one, which is as much as the intelligence agencies use this RICA process to monitor the communications of people living in this country, there's a lot of surveillance of communications that happens completely outside of any lawful framework. Completely outside of the RICA framework. Right to Know last year submitted a promotion of access to information application, asking our telecom service providers to say, using the Criminal Procedures Act, and this is Section 205, how many of those, in those cases, how many numbers do you hand over to the authorities? Now, the RICA judge is required by Parliament, required by the Intelligence Oversight Act, which then requires Parliament to report on stats around how many of these warrants he or she issues every year. The numbers around that vary. It varies between 2 to 300, 400 in the last report. There hasn't been a report released for this year. What Right to Know discovered through its PARI application, looking at the Criminal Procedures Act, is that this number is in excess of 70,000 numbers annually, which are released to the authorities, which allow for metadata to be surveilled. Now, obviously, this shows that the problem is, although the problem is with RICA, the problem is also with the CPA, which allows for this to happen, and allows for this to happen at any court. So any magistrate's court may give a warrant for this kind of surveillance of communications to take place. So Right to Know, in addition to supporting the Amabungani RICA challenge, is also going to be pursuing a separate application, challenging the constitutionality of this procedure around the ability of telecom service providers to simply hand over the metadata of their clients and to such a large scale. Whilst adequate safeguards should be contained in lawful processes, it's not sufficient for it only to be about legislation or lawful processes, but it needs to be about the ability of our criminal oversight institutions to do their jobs. Now, one of the features of state capture and one of the original sites of state capture under Zuma's administration was to hollow out our crime fighting institutional capacities. And so the NPA was one of the first sites of capture, as well as hollowing out of institutions. The Hawks as well were a key site of capture and hollowing out of institutions. What's interesting in terms of the relationship between the intelligence agencies and these other institutions, such as the NPA, is to connect the dots between the individuals. So, for example, we see that the former National Director of Public Prosecutions himself had gotten himself caught into the murky waters of being involved with an individual who used what we in South Africa call the grabber, so a mass surveillance tool. And also that Arthur Fraser himself was complicit in trying to get Zuma's charges dropped through leaking the spy tapes. So one of the mechanisms which must be brought into a conversation about reform of the intelligence agencies is about strengthening the capacity of these vital institutions. And so a conversation about intelligence reform must also be about the ability of our prosecutorial authorities to do their jobs and building up that capacity. One area which I think is not given enough attention, and I look to Mike across the room over there, is in this conversation about intelligence reform, is what's happening in our defense intelligence sector. Now, it's often not given the same kind of scrutiny as our state security agencies, simply because, again, it's seen as a legitimate site of secrecy, because, of course, our borders need to be protected from a threat which we don't know. Finally, I think, although fixing institutions, fixing oversight structures, fixing laws is important, the ultimate responsibility or the ultimate pressure point, which we saw as vital to pushing against state capture prior to this year, has been about the public's ability to create enough momentum around these issues to change the politics. It is our assessment as Amabungani, but I suppose many others may or may not agree with this, that although there was reporting around state capture, it was because civil society, the public, came out to talk about it. Academic institutions like PARI wrote about it. It was because there was consensus within the public discourse that state capture was a fundamental problem, which eventually became the momentum to push back against state capture. And in the same way, if we want to see the kinds of reforms in the way that intelligence agencies abuse their power, there needs to be the same kind of consensus to push back against the kinds of abuses of power which we see. There's a quote which is attributed to Benjamin Franklin, which is actually not his quote, but it's a useful way of framing it, which says, those who give up liberty, have then no right to demand their safety. Now, it's not a Benjamin Franklin quote, but essentially what this speaks to is, if we as a public are willing to say the intelligence agencies have got free rein because we want to stay safe, then essentially we don't have the same kinds of rights to demand a democracy. Now, I think it's a slightly unfair phrasing of giving up rights in order for security, simply because we see in the last 10 years that it's been the state itself which has taken away the rights rather than members of the public themselves who have given up these rights to our intelligence agencies. I'm going to stop at that point.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Before I give it to the floor, the reform agenda that Karabo speaks about, how does that look like in communities? Like, have we done that? Have we not failed in a sense?
Well, I mean, we didn't get to talk about this, but you know, part of the closing down of the space, not just in information terms and other things, was the way in which the state responded to the initial dissent from civil society communities. Let's say, for example, in the late 1990s, over electricity and water and what has now become all the service delivery, called the service delivery protest, was a closing down of all the institutional democratic spaces available to the citizenry. So everything from your ward committee to your local council to everything, the budget hearings, everything, all of these things get closed down or they get completely manipulated so that the only option for communities is to basically go onto the streets. So it's a self-fulfilling thing, and then you have the repression. And in terms of the reform agenda, I think from communities, I don't think it's been a failure necessarily. It's just that communities are so taken by the most immediate kinds of issues and the immediate defense of those basic rights that the sort of issues about reforming the intelligence and security first are sort of pushed to the side. So it doesn't become a particular thing that's primarily onto the agenda, other than when it interferes with regards to the local context. So I don't think it's necessarily a failure. It's a way of just trying to connect the dots better and to make it very clear to a lot of communities that the reason why certain things are happening at local level is also because of intelligence and security structures at local levels doing precisely what. So we've focused on the national macro context. We haven't focused on the local municipal context. But if you go into the deep dive in Mpumalanga, in Northwest, in KZN, it's exactly, you get so yes, there is a lot of work to be done there to bring communities, to connect the dots and say, you see with the political killings that are happening now in KZN, that's beginning to happen because people are feeling that directly, and they're feeling that the manipulation of the services is being felt at that level. But I think it is a political imperative for civil society to begin to go deep. In other words, most civil society wants to concentrate, here's the Zondo Commission, the big things, the big institutions, but the people themselves are left behind with regards to how that impacts on them directly.
Sure. I don't think that communities are unaware. I think Dale is correct to say it's about what is the priority in terms of an agenda. What certainly see from whistleblowers who come, and not just Amabungani, but other media organizations, is a legitimate realization that communications are not secure. And so you see, an activist will say, I want to speak up, but I know that I don't want to use my phone because it might be being tapped. So it might not be a detailed knowledge of how the surveillance capacities work, but it is an understanding of this is a reality, and when I want to speak up, that this may happen. I know that there's been many community protesters who have spoken about, we want to plan a protest, but then we see a crime intelligence officer who wants to know who we are, they want to collect our ID. So I think there's a reality of what the problem is. As much as I'm a strong advocate of the momentum around reform must come from a mass base, there is a responsibility on the state to itself reform the kinds of surveillance architecture which is in place. A very basic step, for example, could be around saying a campaign to say SIM card registration just simply shouldn't take place. It's got no effectiveness when it comes to crime fighting. The evidence shows that. And another area which has I think, mobilizes communities is around the collection of biometric data. And so people do want to know, but why must I give up why do I need to use my fingerprint to identify myself? Why do I need to give away some of my, so it might not be spoken about in the ways that the macro issues are spoken about, but certainly there's a sort of an intrinsic understanding of the issues.
And then the last part, we can look at safeguards, look at the excessive secrecy and look at oversight institutions. How do we deal with the way in which government seems to deal with this institution just to hold back funding? Like, how do we deal with that part of the problem where they're poorly funded? So you may have nice legislation that establishes them and gives them autonomy and independence, gives them everything that you've spoken about. How do we deal with it on the funding level? Then we'll go to the floor.
Well, since we're sitting in this room and the midterm budget review is happening right now, it'd be great to know where the money is going. One of the realities is that our national fiscus has been deprived of the kinds of resources because of the effects of corruption. And so the national fiscus is facing the challenge of what to prioritize, how to prioritize it, and where does the money go. So there is that reality. On the other hand, I think the parliamentary system has got a very powerful role in terms of being able to listen to these oversight institutions when they come before to say, in order to do the work, I require certain resources for the office. We saw this with the previous public protector. She would often go before the Justice Committee at the time to say, in order to do the work that must be undertaken by this particular office, we need a further budget. The MPs at the time refused to robustly take up her demands. With the oversight institutions around intelligence, the difficulty is the ability of the MPs responsible to understand the reason why. And for two reasons. One is that there isn't enough information given to MPs around this. Secondly is that the Oversight Committee within Parliament for our intelligence agencies is the Joint Standing Committee on Intelligence, and it does its work almost completely in secrecy, and that's unnecessary again. And so the kinds of public pressure which could be useful for this particular committee to be able to then say to Parliament when there's debate around budget allocations is simply there isn't enough opportunity for public pressure to happen there. So I think it's both the responsibility of Parliament as an oversight institution to, when Treasury says there's only enough money for this, to be able to say, but based on our understanding of the information that's being presented to us by these oversight institutions, there's a strong argument for increasing their budget, because ultimately the effect of this will be to save money from the national fiscus, because you know with the intelligence agencies there's a huge amount of wasteful expenditure and just plain corruption which allows this kind of money drain to happen.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think that where we need to go in terms of civil society is a campaign to, I would say, breathe new life into the regulatory frame. If you look at the Chapter 9 institutions and the regulators, the story of the last 24 years has been a consistent attempt to undermine them in the context of hobbling them financially as well as capacity-wise. Tuli Madonsela showed that you could do something with an institution, even with limited resources, and she became the heroine of, whatever. And so we've got the Financial Intelligence Center. I don't know how many people know the absolute centrality of what the Financial Intelligence Center is supposed to do, and the regulatory. The Financial Sector Conduct Authority, the former Financial Services Board, which oversees all provident and pension funds, the largest capital collections of capital that are being completely, this is a whole other story, they're going to be completely raided and used for private, talk about corruption. What you see in the Zook is small fry compared to what's going on with the billions that are being shifted out from provident pension funds and used for all sorts of other kinds of things. So I think that there has to be a campaign. We've got to start a campaign to resuscitate the prioritization of our oversight and regulatory mechanisms and bodies. I don't think it's a question of increasing budget. I think it's a question of redirecting budget. I think there's plenty of funds out there. It's a question of putting the right people into place, and so the capacitation, the personnel aspect of that has to be. But I think the experience over the last 25 years with all of these different campaigns, and Karabo's absolutely right, is if it doesn't come from the people, yes, we can have internal processes, yes, but if we leave this up, if people think that Ramaphosa and the technocrats who have a much more sophisticated view of things are going to sort this out, they're sadly naive and mistaken. Ramaphosa is just as dedicated to secrecy in a different kind of way. He's dedicated to secrecy. If the mining sector and the extractive sector we were to blow that out, it would bury him as well as most of his mates in a whole range of possible corrupt activities, tax evasion, illicit financial flows, a whole range. We don't even have an idea of these things. So what I'm trying to say is that we have to have a campaign from below. And yes, we can do the policy, yes, we can do legislation, but if we should have learned any lesson from the last 24 years, it's the only thing that's going to fundamentally change this is power from below.
Okay, now time for all of you. Questions, we've got a roving mic. Questions, comments. Anyone? Someone? Michael?
Great. Perfect. Thanks. Yeah, this seems unfair because both of you have pointed to me at various points in the presentation. But maybe to bring together a couple of the experiences that we've had and then to just ask a general question. Looking at, so there were a couple of things that particularly Dale, you raised about continuities between apartheid era and today. And I think very interestingly, the combination of domestic and foreign intelligence and the way that has happened now. And I was wondering how much we do know about the relationship between intelligence agencies in South Africa now and foreign intelligence agencies. And I'm thinking particularly about, I think 2015, the spy cables came out. And there was such interesting information in there about the way the SSA was interacting with Mossad, who obviously there would be a very long-running relationship with due to the close nature of the Israeli apartheid South Africa relationship. It was clear that the SSA were, to use a colloquial term, pretty pissed off with Mossad at various points, and they were running kind of counterintelligence operations to trail Israeli agents. But at the same time, they were working with them to look at intelligence on Egypt and what was happening at the time there. And I'm just wondering how much insight we have into how those relationships operate. And also, I suppose, as a follow-up question to that, what that means for tech. I know Right to Know has done a lot of work on trying to find out, where are the grabbers coming from? Are more sophisticated agencies sharing that stuff with the South African agents? Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, I give it to you guys to respond to Michael.
Do you want a few more questions?
I don't see any. Yeah.
Everybody's got it sorted out. Okay, that was fine, maybe it'll raise. The bottom, it's a very good question, Michael, and the short answer is we don't know much. I can point to areas where, there's things that have come up, for example. I know that I think it was 2 or 3, at least 3 years ago, where there was a report that the CIA had been brought in to train South African intelligence services in a whole range of new sophisticated technology, as well as in conjunction with AFRICOM. So if anybody is aware of the United States military and AFRICOM, which is the command for Africa, over the last 10 years, I think the number of bases, and that means whether it's drone or 5 individuals or an entire base, have tripled in this continent in terms of things. So there's joint military exercises that have been run. So I think there's quite a bit of, it seems as though, even though we don't have any empirical proof that this is the case, quite a bit of connectivity, at least at the intra-training level and sharing of information to a certain extent between intelligence services in the United States and military intelligence in particular, with peacekeeping operations as well, I think in the DRC, tracking terrorist-related activities in the Horn and West Africa as well. And the other, I was just trying to think of the other foreign intelligence service that we had heard. And this was sort of secondhand information. But the British intelligence services in MI5, I think it is, or MI6, which one is it? I can't remember which is the domestic and which is the foreign. Coming in, also doing some internal, sort of capacity building and information sharing. But the bottom line is we don't know much. And it's a totally sort of dark area with regards to what connections there are, who's influencing. Everything, though, that I have seen, and I think the Right to Know seen with regards to intelligence services, is indicative that most foreign intelligence, as I mentioned earlier, most foreign intelligence services see the SA ones as being, I think the word that was used, amateurish, and very, very open to manipulation and to bribery and to counter-intelligence activities. And it wouldn't be, if you look at what's going on internally, then in relation to people being bought off and being used politically, then it's not a far stretch to imagine that our intelligence services are possibly riven with a whole range of compromised individuals passing information on and doing all sorts of things, although we have no proof of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and similar to Dale, we don't know enough about it. But I mean, for example, what is it, 2-3 weeks ago, the Sunday Times, the Sunday Times reported that our current Minister of State Security, Letsatsi Duba, had a trip to Saudi Arabia cancelled. And I think that is telling in terms of the willingness of our intelligence agencies to work alongside their intelligence counterparts in regimes which are fundamentally probably opposed to our democratic principles. And another part you didn't raise in your question, but is around what kind of intelligence gathering is done by foreign intelligence of us. And one example or case of that happened with the Legal Resources Centre and GCHQ in the UK, who essentially had swept their data in their foreign intelligence gathering. And although that has been successfully challenged, in the latest surveillance case law around Big Brother Watch, one of the questions which was put before the European Court was this question of foreign intelligence gathering through these undersea cables. And the judgment in that regard did not seem to find fault with mass surveillance which happens of foreign intelligence signals. And so whilst there were strong findings against things, for instance, like surveillance of journalists and other important points made by that judgment, the capacity of foreign intelligence agencies from other governments to essentially put people in this country under surveillance legitimately, so it would be metadata rather than your actual communications, is problematic as well. And so we don't have enough information about how much of that happens and what kind of recourse we would have of another country's foreign intelligence agencies essentially invading the privacy and rights of people in this country.
One other example, with Zimbabwe CIO. If you remember when the spy cables came out in 2015, and the WikiLeaks and the spy cable, what they revealed was that the State Security Agency, the CIO, had been cooperating and sharing information on rogue NGOs that were undermining the constitutional order. Of course, that was when Mugabe was still in power, but I have no doubt that Mnangagwa is in fact, he could be worse, and he's more of a spook than Mugabe was. So I think there's certainly evidence that intelligence services in Zimbabwe and others, and then there was also indications when Ian Khama was still the president of Botswana, and he was also coming out of that in security intelligence structures, that there was a great deal of sharing of information between the Botswana intelligence services as well as, and some of it was supposedly about crime, but we don't know. But yes, in terms of our immediate neighbors, there is some evidence that there's obviously activities.
If there's, okay. Oh, nice.
So two questions for Dale. I think the first one is, what do you make of sort of the move of Ramaphosa of just simply moving Arthur Fraser as opposed to firing him or some kind of a sort of disciplinary sort of process? The second thing is, give us some of your thinking around, why Zuma thought that it would be, he would be sort of successful, and what in sort of citing an intelligence report to remove Pravin and ABC from their post. And I think for Karabo, what are some of the available avenues for journalists in terms of trying to protect themselves from what's happening? I mean, you've given quite a damning picture. Yeah.
And then
Dale, one of the things you said is that what we've learned from the last 24 years is that power from below is important. But the other thing we've also learned, most recently, in the last few years, is that the civil society has been also under tremendous attack. And we are also, I think, in the face of, when we talk about state capture, the amounts of money that have been stolen and the kinds of war chests that are available for the fight back campaigns. We are a ragtag bunch. I mean, if we're thinking about power from below, we are also busy congratulating ourselves in many ways that it's civil society, it's the media, it's the judiciary that in some ways we're able to be something of a bulwark against what could have been in the Zuma decade. I'm wondering how then that power from below gets mobilized going forward when we think about how to continue to be vigilant going forward. How do we mobilize that power from below?
Can you just take one more and then...
Morning all. Is it on? Sorry. Morning. The name is Kugan Pillay. Working with various civil society organizations in the last couple of years, and also former advisory board member of former public protector Thuli Madonsela. Just to add to the last question from the previous gentleman, Dale, you know, we saw this in the mid-80s, the power of organized civil society, the UDF, organized labor in toppling the apartheid regime. And you know, going back to the previous question, Dale, how do you see this mobilizing power from below? In the last year, I spent a lot of time with organized civil society in the form of Future South Africa, a coalition of various civil society organizations at the height of state capture. And obviously after December, after the elective conference results of December of the ANC, civil society has kind of gone back into its comfort position, thinking that, you know, everything is over, and I think Dale is quite correct. We are far from resolving the problems that have been created in the last couple of years. We still have to rebuild the institutions of our democracy that have been tarnished and damaged. So, important question is, how do we see this process happening? I mean, last year there was lots of activism, and suddenly the problems have not been resolved. If anything, we are now inheriting the mismanagement of the last couple of years, and you're seeing it in increased VAT, increased fuel price, increased food prices, a whole lot of things that are affecting the most vulnerable and marginalized sections of the citizens. Thanks.
Okay, got our point, Dale.
Sure. I mean, I'll do the quick one. So what are journalists doing? What are journalists doing? Well, basically, I think it's important to know that your phone is basically a spy in your pocket. And so I know that with our investigative unit, but with others, it's when somebody does come forward and say, I've got information to share, it's just advising them, you know, they're secure and unsecure mechanisms of communication. So it's letting your sources know that this is a more secure way of talking. It's getting back to basics, and so not using electronic communication at all when that's required. It's doing I don't want to be prescriptive, but it's doing a security assessment on particular stories that are being worked on at a particular time. But I think it's important for the journalistic sector to take the obligation, and I think that this is an obligation for journalists to ensure that their sources are kept safe. We were just, I was about to say, the right to know mailing list, but there was a discussion just talking about the kinds of things that are happening to state capture related whistleblowers in the Premier League provinces, so in the Free State and in Mpumalanga, and essentially them being killed. And so because the risk is so heightened, the obligation for journalists to act in a way which both honors and protects sources is beyond crucial. So it's about education with sources, it's about keeping communication secure, it's about using different technological means to do so. Those would be the three things. Yeah, just in talking generally, but yeah.
Okay, just to try to, what was my opinion in terms of why Ramaphosa moved Fraser? I think it's quite clear why he moved and didn't get rid of him. It's because Fraser's got lots and lots of dirt on lots of people, just like Zuma. The power of a lot of the spooks in this administration is that they have a lot of information. And it's basically, you can blackmail, you can hold people account. And Ramaphosa has got a lot to hide. And so does many of his friends and his crew with regards to how they have come about their wealth and what kinds of deals have been struck and all sorts of other things, I think, that just touch the iceberg So remember, you know, Zuma's major card up until he resigned, I think when he realized the writing was on the wall, was to play things off against people, off against each other, and to basically threaten that I'm going to expose you if you come after me, kind of thing. And I think in this case, Fraser is seen as, there's a degree of loyalty to him because he's seen as a longtime caterer. He went back in MK, he was a, you know, he's been close to that center of power for a long time. So there's obviously personal and political relationships that might play themselves out. But I think ultimately, the reason why he's been kept on board is the old adage that it's better to have someone inside the tent, pissing inside the tent than outside. Essentially, it can control them because there might be the possibilities of what he might say or might do outside if he feels completely alienated and abandoned might be much worse. So that's why I think that he's done so in terms of Fraser. Why did Zuma, and what was the reason for, you know, false flag? Anybody who knows anything about intelligence and counterintelligence knows that false flag reports and operations have been legion in all intelligence services. You create fake, what we call fake news, whatever. It's a fake report. Trump has become the expert at this, and you know, basically, you get people to think that obviously that certain people can be blamed, that it's foreign intelligence aid, there's third forces, that foreign NGOs that are being funded by George Soros are undermining our sovereignty or whatever it is. I mean, these things are I mean, they're playing out in Europe right now, in Hungary. You know, George Soros is the state enemy #1 against the state because he's spending his money to undermine sovereignty. So I think the false flag operations are standard intelligence fare. Zuma and them were just, and I'm sorry to say, but they were stupid in the context of the way they thought that they were so badly constructed. Did you read those intelligence reports? I don't know if you read them. They were like a kid in 3rd or 4th grade had written them. They were so badly constructed. The grammar was so bad. It was just hard to even believe. At least they could have gotten somebody decent to write it. And they were, okay, that's a bit believable. So they almost shot themselves in the foot because it just didn't seem credible. But the purpose of it is to confuse. The purpose of it is to put, you know, the cat amongst the pigeons, to basically make people think, no, maybe it is. Because in the context of South Africa, as you can see with social media, conspiracy theories and all sorts of wild allegations they take up very quickly, and people push them around. And all of a sudden, foreigners are responsible for bringing in and poisoning food in spaza shops, and therefore they must be attacked, and we must kill all foreigners. And we have a political party, the African Basic Movement, which is just registered with the IEC, whose prime platform is that all foreigners must leave South Africa within 5 years. A political party that's just registered. Unheard of. I mean, and this is as a result of, I would argue, these kinds of things. So they use it in order to confuse people, in order to basically muddy the waters and make it appear so that people can actually spend your time, and progressive and other forces spend their time fighting the fires over here, and then while they can get on with looting and doing whatever it is that they want to do on this side. It's classic. Mokaseni, the idea of the ideas of people's power, the civil society, and how do we, you know, we are a ragtag bunch, and we are sometimes our own worst enemy in terms of I think civil society. And why do I say that? Is because I think we could be 10 times more effective than what we are. But we have adopted a siloed attitude within civil society. We have, it's almost as if we have mirrored the state. If you look at sometimes the incapacity of the state to do things, it's because one is not speaking to another. You've got within the same department, you've got people that don't know what they're doing. And so you have one running in this direction, another one running in this direction, spending huge amounts of money, and then it collapses, the entire project. Same in civil society and people from below. We all think that because, you know, I'm in this area, it's an environmental issue, or I'm in this area, it's a policy issue. I remember having huge arguments with Ivor, let's be clear, in PARI, you know, a few years ago when PARI was started. And I said, Ivor, you know, it would be great if organizations in the mass can pick up with policy where he goes, no, we work inside, we don't work outside the state. We don't work, we don't cause trouble. We have, in other words, basically, our access to information is dependent upon our relationships with people within the state, and we don't want to mess with those. Because if then we criticize them too much, we might lose that kind of stuff. To me, that was a very short-term perspective in terms of we need a multi-tactical, open civil society that is willing to come together so that you don't see people who are in the streets burning tires as troublemakers, but here, when we're going to Parliament and lobbying on a particular piece of legislation, we're doing it properly. And we're doing it within the framework of democracy and the bounds of what's acceptable. These things are part of the same struggle, and they must be seen. So creating those bridges, I think, is fundamentally important to creating that power, right? It's an organization, and this was shown to us. I mean, Coogan, you mentioned it. The basic success of the 1970s, 80s was the glue that held a very ideologically diverse, very, very different kinds of organizations together. Why? Because they had a particular goal. That goal is no longer there. You know, they're not trying to overthrow the state. So what is our democracy, freedoms, these kinds of things? And we, unfortunately, in South Africa, the other element which I think we have to get away from, and this is like weaning a baby off of the mother's milk, which is that we think that politics is party politics. That's the other problem. That when you want power, you have to form a party and you have to go into the state and you have to do this. I think we have to get away from this notion that actually where power truly lies is in people's organizations that aren't connected with institutional power in the context of going in and playing by party rules and party game. Because basically when you establish a party, you're going to do that. So I think in that context, we need to move away. 2 or 3 other points with regards to this is that we need to encourage I would argue that the debate and dialogue that takes place within civil society is just in its infancy. We have a situation, and tell me if I'm wrong, but the way I look at it now is that we've got a lot of voices out there, a lot of anger, a lot of disappointment, a lot of mobilization, but people are shouting and screaming at each other. They're talking past each other. We've lost the ability as progressive forces in the civil society to actually have dialogue amongst ourselves and to actually have debate and to come together on some common platform. What we do is we tend to think, no, I'm here, and we're going to, contest those positions. So debate and dialogue, I think, is fundamental, and sharing of information. I remember when the penny dropped for me in terms of civil society a few years ago when I entered into the storage facility of a large NGO, and I found tens of thousands of copies of research reports, information, all sorts of things sitting there. And I asked them, why are these things sitting there? And said, well, when we budgeted, we had no distribution budget. Okay? And we produce huge amounts of information, many studies, but hardly anybody sees those things on the ground. So how are people who then march supposed to understand that actually there is something that's been done about the municipal budget? We can get that information. We know about it because it's such an NGO or such a research institute. But no, we hold a seminar inside a university with university academics to share the information and it never gets out of that. So we have to break down the barriers of information sharing amongst ourselves so that we empower each other with the kinds of works that we do. And I think that is another area where power can then be multiplied when you've got access to all of those things. I was just watching this documentary last night, This Land, I don't know if you've seen it, about the KZN land. It's a powerful, powerful film, documentary. And one of the things that comes out of that, as well as the Amadiba crisis and all these land issues where mining companies are coming in and everything else, is that the ordinary people are saying, when we actually were able to access information about what the mine was doing and who was involved and everything else, we get to understand what it gave us the power in order to then mobilize against it. So we had lawyers coming together, NGO Research Institute coming together, community organization coming together, policy outfit coming together. That creates a much more powerful, powerful movement than it is of us working each in our own little place.
Shall we close it here? Thank you so much for all of you for coming. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys did well.
Thank you. You did well.
And we...
Did it go flat?
I'm Lucky Ronald Minwe. I'm the Deputy Director at Corruption Watch. Welcome to this session, which will be addressing the capture of the criminal justice system. Today I'm joined by 4 panelists. David Bruce, who's an independent researcher, Amanda Shibambo, who's a colleague of mine from Corruption Watch, who's our legal researcher, Gareth Newham from the ISS, and Lawson Naidu from KSEC. What we'll be doing is we will be just giving you an understanding of what we mean when we talk about the capture of the criminal justice system. And I think at Corruption Watch, we've got a campaign currently which is embedded around the African Union declaration for 2018, which the head of states have declared 2018 to be African Year of Anti-Corruption. And the theme for this year is winning the fight against corruption, a sustainable path to Africa's transformation. This declaration and the actions stemming from it provide a rallying point for all actors, those are state and non-state actors, to help consolidate gains made over the years and show greater progress in the fight against corruption in Africa. Corruption Watch is a chapter of Transparency International, and as we speak, there's a conference going on in Copenhagen in Denmark where all chapters of Transparency International are meeting, and this topic is highly discussed by African chapters and other organizations from around the globe. And South Africa is also being used as a test to discuss what is state capture, how did it happen in South Africa, and what can we do to stop it. So our focus, the focus for our discussion is going to be on the South African Police Services. It's going to be on the National Prosecuting Authority, the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, the Scorpion, which was part of the NPA, the Hawks, the South African Revenue Services, the Special Investigating Unit. When you listen to this, some of these institutions are just complementary arms of the criminal justice system's apparatus, as they do not investigate. They don't have the investigative function, but what they do not have the powers to arrest or the power to institute prosecutions. But we want to focus on them as an organization and on this project that we are embarking on as Corruption Watch. David Bruce is the lead researcher on this particular project, and then we've made a few strides in terms of that project. And what will be happening is that since we've got the Commission on State Capture going on, we aim to make a submission to the Commission based on the paper that we're developing on this program. As we are running out of time, I'm not going to take a lot giving an overview of the session. I'll just hand over to the panel. We've got 4 panelists. I'll give each of them 10 to 15 minutes, maybe 10, so that we have enough time for discussions and engagement. But I will start with David Bruce, who will just give us, what are we talking about here? Who will give us an overview of what is the capture of the criminal justice system and how does it look like? Over to you, Bruce.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So my understanding is that what we're trying to do in this roundtable is move towards a discussion around the responses by civil society and others to this manipulation of the criminal justice system. And so I understand my role as providing a kind of introductory input, which is about just setting some kind of parameters about what we're talking about. So I guess, referring back to what Lucky was saying, when we're talking about criminal justice institutions, we're talking about institutions which have the power to label people as criminals. And so, and they related to the criminal justice process. And so it's primarily, when we're talking about criminal justice institutions, we are talking about the police and the NPA. The IPID also qualifies as a criminal justice system. If one looks at the SIU or SARS, they aren't actually criminal justice institutions insofar as they don't have any of this kind of power to, for instance, arrest people and categorize them as criminals. But what they often play is, in some ways, they can potentially play a type of supportive role or a complementary role in relation to the criminal justice system. So, so when we're talking about manipulation of the criminal justice system, we're talking about you know, these kind of core institutions, and then what seems to be a particular focus area then is what one could call the kind of type of apex or investigative institution. And so we had this whole story with the scorpions that unfolded during the 2000s, the first decade of this century, and then, you know, the transformation, if that's not the wrong word, of that organization into the DPCI. And so that institution is supposedly a kind of central and pivotal institution in relation to a kind of architecture, criminal justice architecture for addressing corruption, along with the NPA. And it seems that in many ways this issue focuses around those two institutions. But nevertheless, so if we're just looking at the Zuma era, then there's been a number of ways in which this manipulation of the criminal justice institutions has been kind of manifest. You know, the first and most obvious things was that the Zuma era started off with the kind of disabling of the scorpions and the deliberate, and so the scorpions had some kind of status as a kind of quite a kind of vigorous and robust anti-corruption investigative agency. And I'm going to return a bit to the question about you know, to what degree it should actually have been regarded as a, you know, truly independent agency. But nevertheless, you know, the key priority, and it was almost a necessary part of the transfer or the transition from the Mbeki to the Zuma era was to disable the scorpions. And then initially there was the creation of this completely much more kind of compromised institution, the DPCI. And so there were a series of court judgments which were intended to kind of buttress the DPCI's independence. But effectively what it seemed that you know, the weak link amongst all this jurisprudence was simply the business that the head of the scorpions, I mean the head of the DPCI, was still appointed by, it's the minister, it's not the president in this case, and so you know, by appointing someone who was compromised, it was possible to kind of effectively neutralize this institution, and so then, but then, you know, and people are all familiar with this. There's the story which is very prominent in the media, the story about the use of kind of leaks. Then, you know, people are suspended, there's boards of inquiry and so on, or people are dismissed or offered packages. So there's, you know, insofar as individuals appear to pose a threat, there's deliberate a kind of program of action to neutralize them. You know, there's direct political pressure. So, for instance, where there are senior officials who are trying to operate in terms of the rule of law principles, there's steps that are taken to neutralize or you know, put pressure on them in order to you know, get them to withdraw from their role. Some of the, you know, prominent cases would be, for instance, the former acting commissioner of the SAPS, Lieutenant General Makhonazi, who wanted to move ahead with the disciplinary action against Richard Mdluli. But then, you know, he was placed under enormous pressure to desist from that and eventually just resign from the position of being acting commissioner. There's the appointment of compromised individuals. There's irregular appointment processes. And so, and you know, the principal example of that being the appointment of Richard Mdluli himself. And so there's, you know, and then there's, you know, where oversight institutions themselves are potentially may kind of seen as posing a threat to the task of or these efforts to kind of compromise the independence of these institutions. There's interference with the oversight institutions, or sometimes the people appointed to these oversight institutions have been, sort of almost kind of willing tools of this type of manipulation. And then, there's other things. There's the use of state resources to fight legal cases, where there's, in relation to which there's no reasonable chance of success, and so on. So where action is taken against people, then there's a kind of delaying. Where, for instance, civil society has tried to take action against people, there's the use of state resources to delay the kind of impact of court judgments and so on. And then the final kind of fallback position seems to be that where people are, as in the case of Shabir Sheikh, are convicted and imprisoned, the business and it's obviously officials within the Department of Correctional Services play a role within this. There's the issue of ensuring that people are released from prison prematurely. So, so then there's a question about kind of continuities, and I had, but I'm going to be quite quick, but there's various things that take place during the Mbeki era, but the one thing is that, right early on, there's various senior appointments. There's the appointment of Bulelani and Guka, there's the appointment of Jackie Selebi, and then there's the appointment of Vusi Pikoli. And all of these are, in many ways are political appointments. And so, I think, insofar as one is seeing the kind of logic of intention that the criminal justice system will work in a manner which is in a way kind of compliant, that seems to kind of obviously falls apart with Vusi Pikoli, who then identifies his responsibilities as being very clearly to the Constitution over and above any loyalty to the ANC. And so there's the whole question about the investigation of the arms deal. And so, for instance, right at the beginning of that whole episode, there was something, the Heath Special Investigations Unit. And Judge Heath was sort of one of these sort of outspoken characters, had a bit of a reputation as being a bit of a firebrand and so on. And it seems then that, there was a interministerial, it was an interagency initiative that had been established, and there was a motivation from within that agency, which included role players like the Auditor General and the head of SCOPA and so on, to ensure that the Heath Special Investigative Unit was appointed to the arms deal investigation. But then, it's the impression that, from revisiting this is that it seems that the Heath Special Investigation Unit was seen as too independent. And so the impression that from revisiting this that I have is that in some ways what President Mbeki was doing was trying to ensure that the arms deal was managed, investigation was managed by the Scorpions. And therefore that, it would be under people who he had a greater level of trust in, people like Bulelani and Guka, and the head of the Scorpions, who was the NDPP, and the head of the Scorpions, Leonard McCarthy. And so, this question, the question about, to what degree were the Scorpions themselves a kind of independent, a robustly independent anti-corruption investigation agency, or to what degree was the investigation and into the arms deal actually carried out in quite a kind of selective way, so that certain people were regarded as kind of fair game for investigation, but other aspects of the investigation were not pursued as vigorously or not at all. And so, yeah, so just there's the issue then that comes up is, you know, the kind of logic that was being applied. And it seems that, yeah, I mean, I just had, you know, a few things, other things to say. So I'm just trying to wrap up at this point because I don't want to go well beyond my time. But I think, so the question, I mean, and I think Dale McKinley referred to this, you know, just, and I think various people have referred to these issues, but the issue of the interests of the ANC as being seen as you know, almost superseding the loyalty to, for instance, the Constitution or the framework that was being put forward within the Constitution. And so, so just on the issue of, sorry, I'm just not quite sure how to wrap up because but so there seems to have been, you know, with the Zuma era, there seems to have been a greater degree to which the criminal justice system was compromised. So, for instance, just, you know, if one looks at the Mbeki era, then I think, you know, it would seem that there was a concern, for instance, to ensure that a higher caliber of person was appointed to, for instance, manage these criminal justice institutions. But nevertheless, you know, there obviously are these issues of continuity. And I think I'm just going to leave it there.
Thank you, David. Let's give him a round of applause. That's quite difficult because I can see you still have a lot of notes on this. But I think during questions and answers, you can address some of the issues. Mr. Gareth Newham, can you just give us an experience from ISS and the work that you've been doing on working with other stakeholders, and also what do we do in response?
Thanks, Lucky, and good afternoon, good morning, everybody. It's good to be here. Yes, I think, you know, when former President Jacob Zuma was appointed president, those that watched the Shabir Sheikh trial closely and had looked at all the evidence kind of knew that on a balance of probabilities, it was highly likely that he had been involved in corruption as deputy president. He was willing, therefore, from what we saw, to use his position to enable foreign colonial-powered arms companies to benefit from South Africa's need to buy arms or desire to buy arms. So when he became president, I think those that had tracked this stuff quite closely were not surprised that he started to shut down the Scorpions, and we expected to see a lot of interference in the criminal justice system. He had a lot to lose, and he had to ensure that those that supported him and who may have been involved in corruption could be protected. And at that time in 2009, I remember having discussions where we kind of said, well, this is likely to happen, and we saw it happening in slow motion over the next 10 years. From our side and civil society side, I think some of the various things that we were trying to do in those years, apart from the organizations involved in litigation who challenged, for example, the rationality of the appointment of Menzies Simelane as the National Director of Public Prosecutions, or the head of the Hawks, Bernie Meza, using the courts, which showed that that was a good strategy. It helped to roll back some of those attempts to undermine the criminal justice system. Those of us not involved in litigation were trying to do research to understand how the impact of the decisions by the president to appoint key people had on the criminal justice system and therefore on public safety. So yesterday, the presentation I gave really tried to draw that link, showing who was appointed when over that period, particularly from 2011 onwards, the direct impact on the criminal justice system, where you just see, despite big increases in budgets, virtually every indicator of performance declining in the police, intelligence, prosecutorial authorities, the Hawks, and how that enabled a growth in organized crime, corruption, the murder rate, street robberies, cash in transit heists. So state capture, although its intention was to enable corruption and protect the corrupt from accountability, cost people in terms of lives. So 4,700 people last year, there were 4,700 more people who were murdered than was the case in 2012. So in 2012, 42 people were murdered a day on average. Last year, that is 56 people murdered a day on average. So state capture didn't just undermine our economy, our ability to grow the economy, solve our problems of unemployment. It cost people in terms of their lives and public safety. All indicators show that. In that time, civil society was trying to, for example, when the Hawks were being established, we, with a number of other organizations, went to Parliament to try and stop the Hawks from being placed in the police, and made lots of recommendations based on the legislation, and we failed because it was a political decision that the Hawks must be subservient. And so, although we had one-on-one discussions with members of the committee who agreed in principle, they could not vote according to their conscience, and so Parliament itself was undermined, which meant that it was very difficult for civil society to achieve much in those years. But we continued, we made inputs into the development of the National Development Plan and helped to explain why there was a serious crisis of police leadership and what that was doing in terms of police professionalism. We pushed back against the idea of militarizing the police, pointing out that that might just lead to more police brutality and it wouldn't actually have any impact on crime, and then demonstrated that it was not having any impact positively on crime. And more recently, we, with Corruption Watch, last year, in fact, launched a police leadership campaign to try and highlight the importance of constraining the presidential of constitutional power to appoint the head of the police service, the National Commissioner. That should first go through a process and that there should be minimum criteria. So we made it very clear to the public that, for example, under the current legislation, the National Commissioner only has to be a South African-born citizen over the age of 18 with no criminal record. And if the president wants you to be the National Commissioner of Police, he or she can appoint you. And that's exactly how we got people like Ria Pierre, who had not a day's experience of policing or understanding how crime operated, and suddenly finding herself heading an organization of 195,000 people, of which 157,000 at the time were armed, trained police officers. Her failings were many. Marikana was the first one, but the dishonesty and the incompetence severely destroyed the police thereafter. Same thing with Burning Intermeza. After being found dishonest by the courts, then appointed Hawks. Menzi Sela, after various inquiries, finding that he didn't understand his role of the NPA and that he might have broken the law interfering, then appointed as the head of the NPA. So this was a pattern. But now moving forward, we are at the very first baby steps when it comes to trying to deal with the aftermath. So for example, in the South African Police Service, we now have a new National Commissioner. However, that National Commissioner, General Kekhe Setolia, was appointed by former President Jacob Zuma, who doesn't or didn't at any point appoint key people to the criminal justice system that he did not believe